Welcome back, young scholars. Today we have to address the difficult topic of the transatlantic slave trade. As captured in that Maya Angelou quote, the purpose of studying history is to not repeat the mistakes of the past, but recognize ultimately, as Dr. Martin Luther King so eloquently puts it, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but ultimately it bends towards justice. And hopefully history allows us to see the injustices of the past so that we can create a more just and equitable world. So the big questions we should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, what were the political characteristics of Africa during the first global age? So we can provide some context for the transatlantic slave trade. Second, why did Europeans turn to slave labor from Africa? Third, what were the effects of the Atlantic slave trade? So first, what are the political characteristics of Africa in the first global age? So when we were in period 3 and we were discussing Africa, we talked about the trans-Saharan trade network that had formed connecting North Africa and West Africa, which led to the formation of states such as Ghana and then later Mali. And you may recall that it was in period 3 that Islam is going to spread across the trans-Saharan network and be embraced by the various kings of Mali, leading to increased conversion to Islam across West Africa. Well, Mali is going to go into a period of decline at the end of period 3, and at the beginning of period 4, they're going to be conquered by a new empire kingdom known as Songhai. And Songhai, like Mali, was a Islamic empire in West Africa. It followed along in the traditions of Ghana and Mali. However, as Atlantic trade increasingly picks up, the trans-Saharan network is going to go into a period of kind of decline in relative importance. And ultimately, Songhai will be conquered by actually some Moroccans up here from North Africa who had more advanced weapons, particularly guns. So as the Atlantic maritime trade is increasing, there's a decreased importance in trans-Saharan trade, which ultimately leads to a weakening of Songhai. So with the increase in Atlantic maritime trade, we're going to see power increasingly shift towards the coast of Africa to kingdoms like Ashanti, which is here along the Gold Coast. Now it's called the Gold Coast because, again, as we've said before, the most valuable resource in this region was gold. And so kingdoms like Ashanti were incredibly powerful. So powerful that, in fact, they could resist Europeans who were coming down to this region to ultimately trade. That wasn't as much the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Portuguese would later go and establish trade relationships with the Congolese people. Now on the east coast of Africa, we talked in period 3 about the Swahili coast states like Mombasa and Mozambique, Kilwa. Well, the Portuguese are going to conquer those city-states and destroy them with their gunboats as part of the formation of this trading post empire. So we're describing kind of similarities that exist with the Portuguese trade post empire and what happened in the Americas with the Spanish. The major similarity in period 4 is really the use of gunpowder weapons, critical for military success. Now in central sub-Saharan Africa, there was a powerful kingdom also known as Congo, and they are also going to establish trade relationships with the Portuguese as the Portuguese were coming around Africa in order to reach Asia. And as we've described before, oftentimes when you're talking about the formation of trade relationships, that also leads to the spreading of religious traditions. In this case, a Congolese king converted to Christianity in 1491, and shortly thereafter, there was widespread conversion to Christianity across Congo. And the impact we can see in art. So for example, here is an image showing Jesus being crucified. And notice, again, the African features here. Now, this isn't the first time that Christianity is spreading to Africa. Remember, in the classical age, we talked about Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia and how Christianity had very early on spread to that region of Africa. So when we're talking about the predominant religion in Africa, in various regions, we see here in North Africa in green, Islam; in sub-Saharan Africa, Christianity; and also in what is kind of the modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea here, Christianity as well. So why did Europeans ultimately turn to slave labor from Africa? Well, to answer this question, we really need to take a brief look at the progression of slavery across world history. So we began talking about slavery at the beginning of the course following the agricultural revolution with the very first civilizations such as Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. We discussed how many of the first slaves were prisoners of war, and that is going to be a major continuity that is going to continue throughout world history, right? Is the way in which slaves were captured in war. As we'll see later on, there's more hereditary slavery, so you can be born into slavery. But again, prisoners of war was a kind of a common way in which people became enslaved. When we got to the classical age, we talked about classical Greek city-states like Sparta and Athens, especially cities like Sparta that were more militaristic, more conquering other city-states. And in the process, they were increasingly coming up with this idea that non-Spartans, it was natural for them to be enslaved because they were somehow some kind of an other. In the Roman Empire, we discussed how there were 33% of the population were enslaved. Increasingly in the Roman Empire, we start to see slaves utilized on large-scale plantations and farms. And then we add into that equation in period 3, the Arab slave trade, and increasingly, as we saw with Ibn Battuta, right? He went down to West Africa, Mali, and brought back with him 300 female slaves to Morocco. And so we're increasingly seeing slavery take on a racial component. And so increasingly the institution of slavery was associated with black Africans. So we take all of the various characteristics that have developed across the span of world history, lower social economic status for slaves, the otherness of non-Greeks, the labor on large-scale plantations, the association of slavery with black Africans, and we really combine them together into really what is one gigantic ball of suck, which is the transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade was the exchange of chattel slaves from Africa for European manufactured goods, especially guns, for use as laborers on plantations in the Americas from the 16th to the 19th century. So I want to highlight a couple things there. First, the slaves were being traded by African kings, warlords, for manufactured goods. And this is going to lead to what's known as the gun slave cycle, because as African kings and warlords get more guns from people like the Portuguese and the Dutch, they ultimately are going to use those guns to conquer more people, thereby leading to even more slaves, which then can be sold for even more guns. So when we look at the progression of the slave trade, we see that it really reaches its peak between 1750 and 1850. So we're dealing with the kind of evolution of the slave trade and the increase of the slave trade across period 4, and then really reaching its pinnacle at the beginning of period 5. Now we use the word chattel slavery, and I want to come back to this. So the word slavery is very difficult to define. There's various forms of slavery throughout history, and each slave's experience is oftentimes very different. So chattel slavery is a form of slavery in which people are treated as personal property or chattel of an owner, and that allows them to be bought or sold like commodities. And so typically when we think about slavery, this is the form of slavery that we typically have, in our minds. Now, I'd draw your attention to the connections between the word chattel and cattle, because for the owner of the slaves to kind of get into their mindset, you have to understand that they truly did view these slaves not as humans, but instead property to be bought and sold. And this would justify, again, the breaking up of families, and also just the terrible, harsh treatment, such as, immediately branding slaves after you've purchased them in order to demonstrate ownership. So we've talked about various coerced labor systems in this class, and we can really think of it as being placed on a spectrum. And at the end of the spectrum here, we're talking about the most restrictive, the least free coerced labor systems, which would be chattel slavery. And then we could put other forms like serfdom and indentured servitude and corvée also kind of fitting within that spectrum. So the cause of the transatlantic slave trade. Well, don't overlook the obvious. So at the root of the transatlantic slave trade was racism. Africans were viewed by Europeans as savages, as biologically inferior, as barbarians, as people who ultimately benefited from slavery. And how do you commit such heinous acts upon another human being and then still sleep at night? Well, the answer is that you justify it using racism. Right? You convince yourself that what you're doing is benefiting somebody else. But again, this is a classic racist attitude. Now, second cause of the transatlantic slave trade was that Europeans were essentially just tapping into existing slave trade in Africa. Now, again, this isn't new. There were slave trades really all over the world at this time period. But we've discussed before how there was an existing Arab trade that was moving slaves across the Indian Ocean region, across the trans-Saharan desert, into the Mediterranean basin. And there was also a lot of warfare along the west coast of Africa, as various kingdoms and tribes were very divided. And ultimately that led to lots of prisoners of war that then Western Europeans like the Portuguese could trade for. So Africans also had a greater resistance to European diseases, as we've described in the past, especially in regions like the Caribbean and Brazil. The native indigenous population was just wiped out by diseases because it was hotter and wetter, and there was a shortage then of labor in those areas, and so the Europeans chose to fill that labor void with African slaves, partly because their increased resistance to European diseases. So a final geographic factor that may have led to the transatlantic slave trade was wind and ocean currents across the Atlantic Ocean. So we can see here how those wind and ocean currents really mimic the major routes of the transatlantic slave trade, especially those leaving West Central Africa and Congo and going up here to the Caribbean and ultimately down here to Brazil, which is where most of the slaves were traded. So wind and ocean currents in the Atlantic made slaves from Africa certainly a lot easier to transport than maybe lower cost laborers from places like China or India across the Pacific. African warlords are going to capture Africans from the interior and ultimately trade those slaves for European manufactured goods on the West Coast, especially guns. And I think this is oftentimes a misconception that some people have about the slave trade, is that Europeans were entering into the interior of Africa, capturing and kidnapping slaves, bringing them out to the coast, and then putting them on the ships themselves, when in actuality, Europeans were not at this point really occupying Africa to any large degree, but instead just arriving on boats near these slave forts that they had created, and just waiting for these African warlords, these African kings, to load up the ships. And we can see that here with this image. This is a powerful Benin king, and you can tell back here that these people aren't African because of their long straight hair. So these are ultimately the Portuguese traders who are creating relationships with these kings of Africa, mainly to trade for slaves in their society. Here we can see one of the slave forts that are still standing on the coast of West Africa. Now, more than 12 million Africans are forced onto ships and ultimately transported across the Americas. And in the next video, we'll have more on the conditions of this journey and where any of these slaves were headed to, and ultimately the effects both in Africa and in the various regions of the Americas to which they migrated. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these first two big questions. What were the political characteristics of Africa during the First Global Age? And why did Europeans turn to slave labor from Africa? Thanks for watching. Welcome back, young scholars. Today we have to address the difficult topic of the transatlantic slave trade. As captured in that Maya Angelou quote, the purpose of studying history is to not repeat the mistakes of the past, but recognize ultimately, as Dr. Martin Luther King so eloquently puts it, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but ultimately it bends towards justice. And hopefully history allows us to see the injustices of the past so that we can create a more just and equitable. West Africa, which led to the formation of states such as Ghana and then later Mali. And you may recall that it was in period 3 that Islam is going to spread across the trans-Saharan network and be embraced by the various kings of Mali, leading to increased conversion to Islam across West Africa. Well, Mali is going to go into a period of decline at the end of period 3. And at the beginning of period 4, they're going to be conquered by a new empire kingdom known as Songhai. And Songhai, like Mali, was a Islamic empire in West Africa. It followed along in the traditions of Ghana and Mali. However, as Atlantic trade increasingly picks up, the Trans-Saharan network is going to go into a period of kind of decline in relative importance, and ultimately Songhai will be conquered by actually some Moroccans up here from North Africa who had more advanced weapons, particularly guns. So as the Atlantic maritime trade is increasing, there's a decreased importance in trans-Saharan trade, which ultimately leads to a world. So the big questions we should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, what were the political characteristics of Africa during the first global age? So we can provide some context for the transatlantic slave trade. Second, why did Europeans turn to slave labor from Africa? Third, what were the effects of the Atlantic slave trade? So first, what are the political characteristics of Africa in the first global age? So when we were in period 3 and we were discussing Africa, we talked about the trans-Saharan trade network that had formed connecting North Africa and West